All right, well, in that case, it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker today, Frank Samolis. He is this year's William and Mary Confucius Institute Distinguished Lecturer. This is a series that we've been running for several years with some really outstanding scholars and practitioners, including people like Barry Naughton, who's come, Elizabeth Perry, last year Bonnie Gold. So we've had some really top specialists, and Frank is very much in the same vein. We couldn't be happier to have Frank joining us. We did just mention it would have been awfully nice if we'd been able to do that in person. We've enjoyed Frank's company many times at William and Mary, and look forward to the day we can do that again. I also want to thank a number of people who made this talk possible before we launch into the lecture and I read his formal bio. First of all, I'd like to thank both Yingnu and Diliang Wang, who are right next to me in the Zoom box here, for their outstanding work in helping to set up everything at the William and Mary Confucius Institute and so much more. I'd also like to thank Beijing Normal University, our Confucius Institute partner, and Hanban, which is the funder of the Confucius Institute. Some of you know that we're in a transition from the Confucius Institute model to a more university-to-university partnership with Beijing Normal University. We suspect that we'll be able to maintain these kinds of events, and so the series will continue in perhaps a new form. I'd also like to thank the law school, William and Mary Law School, and Professor Jen Stevenson, who is here with us as well, for their help in organizing this, as well as the International Law Society at the law school. And it's a pleasure too to welcome our MBA students, EMBA students, and our friends from the Mason School of Business at William and Mary to this talk. Let me say a few words about Frank and give you a sense of his amazing accomplishments. Frank, as you know, is a partner at Squire Patton Boggs in Washington. He handles matters before the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, other executive branch trade agencies, the U.S. International Trade Commission, U.S. Court of International Trade, U.S. Customs Service, and the U.S. Congress. Frank has represented foreign sovereigns or foreign multinationals from Asia, Europe, Central and Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East, in addition to U.S. companies seeking expanded access in major export markets. He counsels clients on the status of negotiations and bilateral regional trade agreements in the World Trade Organization and other fora, and he has represented several sovereign entities in free trade agreement negotiations with the United States. Frank has been active on legislative matters such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, which, as you know, we did not continue, the implementation of the US-Korea Free Trade Agreement, which we did, the US-Colombia Free Trade Agreement, the US-Peru Free Trade Agreement, the Uruguay round of GATT trade negotiations, and the list goes on and on. Appointed by the US Trade Representative and Secretary of Commerce to an Industry Trade Advisory Committee in 1992, Frank consulted regularly as a private sector advisor with senior US government officials on policy issues and solutions. Previously, Frank was counsel to the subcommittee on trade of the Committee of Ways and Means in the US House of Representatives. I could give you a list of his other accomplishments, but it would take much of our time. As you can see already, we are dealing with one of really the top specialists and practitioners in this field today. And we are indeed incredibly grateful, Frank, and honored that you've joined us today to speak on the topic of US-China trade war, a view from Washington. Please join me in a warm William and Mary welcome virtually for Frank Samolis.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Steve, thanks for your kind words and introduction. It's been a pleasure coming to William and Mary. I think it's been about 8 years now. With Steve and Jennifer, who have always been gracious hosts and have arranged for me to speak on a variety of topics. So it's great to be back, even if it's virtual. Hopefully next year we'll be back in person. But this is the best we can do. So Steve gave you my background. I should mention I have represented those countries on negotiating free trade agreements. I represented Colombia and Peru on their free trade agreements, as well as Korea, which is still a client that I advise on trade issues in Washington. I should also disclose at the outset that we do represent the Embassy of China here in Washington. It's been a great relationship for, I think, the past 9 years. But given the China trade wars, the embassy thankfully understands that we have clients who have issues with China, market access in China. So we've reached an accommodation on what we can and cannot be doing. As you might imagine, it's been quite a whirlwind particularly the last few years in terms of international trade broadly and China in particular. Just to put the U.S.-China relationship in context, what I sort of call the modern U.S.-China relationship has to begin when China acceded to the WTO almost 20 years ago. That was December 11th of 2001. And contrary to some reports or news articles, the negotiation for China's accession was not an easy thing for either party. It was long, drawn out negotiations. There were political aspects for both countries. It was a huge step forward, and it really did mark the beginning of a modern trade relationship. Since that time, there have been numerous trade complaints, both in China and the United States, which is not to be, it shouldn't be a surprise, anti-dumping and countervailing duties and so forth. The trade deficit with China has been a concern for many years, but the structure of the relationship has basically been sound, and I think it will prosper going forward. There was a bit of a curveball with the election of Donald Trump, and I'm going to get into that in a minute, but the Trump administration really has recalibrated the relationship. I'm sure you've read a lot of these issues, but let me begin now, if we can go to the next slide, on some of the key political developments in the Trump administration. If you remembered, when he was campaigning, he made trade a big issue. He was going to have a trade policy that protected domestic industries. He was going to strengthen trade enforcement. He was going to actively use some trade statutes, such as Section 232 and 301. I'm going to get into that later on in my lecture. And applying punitive tariffs, typically aimed at China, but they're not alone. A lot of other countries have been affected by these tariffs. Trump has remained focused on trade reciprocity. It's not something that a lot of economists agree with, that a trade deficit by definition indicates who's the winner and who's the loser in any particular relationship. That's not really the way most economists, or I for that matter, see it. But we saw in January 2019 the return of the US Congress, the House of Representatives controlled by the Democrats, the Senate with the Republicans. And despite those differences, I think it's fair to say that both sides have concerns about the China relationship. They have different tactics, different strategies, but there seems to be a broad consensus on developing an important relationship, an important policy to address China. Next slide, please. Okay, here's a quick snapshot just to remind you, bring you up to date as to the Trump administration. He took office in January of 2017. 3 days later, as Steve referred to, he withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He campaigned that he would do that, and he certainly did. My personal view is it was probably not a wise thing to do, but nevertheless, he withdrew. In May of that year, he appointed Robert Lighthizer, who was confirmed in May as the U.S. Trade Representative. And he also transmitted a letter to Congress of his intent to renegotiate NAFTA. You remember that was also part of his platform. At the outset, he had a few stumbles. He declared that the Secretary of Commerce would be his lead negotiator for the new NAFTA agreement. Unfortunately, the law requires the U.S. Trade Representative to be that person. So somebody quickly corrected him on the legal requirements, and Mr. Lighthizer led those negotiations. March of 2018, U.S. and Korea announced an agreement to update the KORUS, the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement. The tariffs on steel and aluminum that are still in place were announced March of 2018, so it's been over 2.5 years. The first 301 tariffs on Chinese imports were in April of 2018. And then you may have forgotten, but in May of 2018, the administration announced another 232 investigation, and I'll explain that statute in a minute, involving automobiles imported from all sources. That investigation was never completed and it's pending action by the administration. September of 2018, US, Mexico, and Canada reached a new replacement for NAFTA, now called the USMCA. We had the midterm elections in November of 2018. February of 2019, that automotive report was submitted to the president. That's where it sits right now. A lot of 301 tariffs imposed on China. Again, I will get into that in more detail later on. December 2019, now we're close to a year from now, Congress passed the USMCA. January of this year, the phase one agreement with China was reached, which resolved a lot of the prior issues that led to the imposition of punitive tariffs. May of this year, remember, the US and the UK initiated negotiations for a free trade agreement. And in June, the US and Kenya started free trade negotiations. That is the first, or will be, if it's enacted, the first free trade agreement with a sub-Saharan African country. We have an agreement with Morocco, but this has an important precedent. So next slide, please. So here are the cast of characters in the Trump administration that have a role in international trade. Everybody from the Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of State, U.S. Trade Representative, of course. I will note on the upper right, Peter Navarro. You may have heard of him. You probably didn't hear of him when he was first announced. I certainly did. And he was put in place of a new agency that was created in the White House called the Office of Trade Policy. So I Googled Peter Navarro and found out that he was the author of several books, two of which, the titles I'll give you right now. One was called The Coming China Wars, and the second one was called Death by China. So I immediately had an impression as to where Mr. Navarro was coming from on international trade, particularly with respect to China. The office that was created for him was subsequently disbanded. He moved around within the administration. Now he's at the Commerce Department for this Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy, but he remains a very influential voice, a very hawkish voice on China trade. And he's somebody that we will all have to contend with. He's much more in line with, excuse me, Mr. Lighthizer, the US Trade Representative, and Wilbur Ross, as opposed to Larry Kudlow and Steve Mnuchin, who tend to be a little more moderate on their international trade positions. Next slide, please. I've talked about Section 232. This is the legal basis for the tariffs that were imposed on steel and aluminum. The Obama administration started looking at global steel overcapacity before the election of Mr. Trump. But as you know, Trump imposed 25% tariffs on steel and 10% tariffs on imported aluminum back in March of 2018. The legal basis for that was a statute that really even trade lawyers weren't familiar with. I sort of knew the statute, but since it was never utilized, it was the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, created and used really by the Eisenhower administration in its early stages, and then was really designed to address the strategic petroleum reserve and oil imports. That was the intent. But the language of the statute on its face makes no mention of petroleum. And the statute, moreover, says that whenever the president determines that there is a threat to national security because of imported products, he essentially can do whatever he wants. So I'm sure somebody in the administration dusted this off and said, look, here's a great tool. You don't have to go to Congress. You don't have to go to the International Trade Commission to get a judgment. Your own administration can make a study. And if they make a positive recommendation, you can do whatever you like. Now, the repeated use of that statute has caught the concern of our Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, who are now talking about amending that statute to make Congress more influential and to really tie down that statute and refine it in a way that reflects the expectations of most members of Congress. Nevertheless, that's the statute. The president has legally used that as the basis for his action. It was the first real, as we say here, the shot across the bow in April 2018. That's when the duties were announced. It wasn't just China, keep in mind, it was also Canada, Mexico, and the European Union, all of whom were affected. Next slide. I think Mr. Trump learned early on that countries that are hit by tariffs such as these are not going to mildly sit by without doing anything. And we had a number of countries, China, Canada, Mexico, the EU, that imposed their own retaliatory tariffs on US goods. So it increased the burden on US manufacturers, farmers, ranchers. The World Trade Organization got involved in deciding whether to rule as to whether 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum are compliant with WTO rules. The position of the Trump administration is that it fits within an exemption that's written into the WTO for national security measures. At the same time, there was a landmark ruling on the Russian-Ukrainian border dispute, where it was found that the invocation of the national security exemption is justiciable and subject to scrutiny by the WTO dispute settlement body. That was kind of a breakthrough in defining what the terms of the national security exemption are. In that case, Kiev complained to the WTO that Moscow, when they were at war in eastern Ukraine, imposed transit restrictions that cut off key markets. So it's the first sign that a broad national security exemption in the WTO is now subject to challenge. So by definition, that precedent would apply to steel and aluminum tariffs. But for the time being, those tariffs remain in place. I should say that there is an administrative procedure to seek exemptions from those tariffs. Our law firm alone has filed over 1,500 petitions on behalf of various companies, including US companies, US manufacturers and steel companies who need to import a particular steel component that is not produced in the US. So there is a process. I think it was overwhelming the Department of Commerce because they did not expect, I think the total number of petitions filed is somewhere in the neighborhood of 30,000. So you can see that there was a great deal of interest in getting exemptions from those tariffs. And we are now left with a situation where the 232 tariffs still in place. There is a process for getting exempted. Some companies do get exempted. We've got a batting average of about 333 or so in getting companies exempted. But it's at this point, a very rote procedure. It doesn't allow for advocacy or legal arguments. You fill out basically a program, and the Department of Commerce people churn it out and give you a decision. Next slide, please. So now we go to Section 301, which is the legal basis for the China trade wars, at least from the US perspective. Section 301 relates to a provision in the Trade Act of 1974. This was pre-WTO, that allowed the United States to act whenever they found another country's actions being unjustifiable, unreasonable, or burdensome on US commerce. And again, the response to that is the US can do unilaterally whatever it deems appropriate under Section 301. With the creation of the WTO back in 1995, Section 301 fell into disfavor. It was used a lot when we were in a trade war with Japan. But because the WTO directed parties to have issues resolved in the WTO and not unilaterally, Section 301 really fell into a state of dormancy until Mr. Trump was elected. Now, there's nothing legally preventing him from invoking that provision. And August 2017 is, roughly 6 months after he was in office, he began the investigation into China's intellectual property protection and tech transfer policies. That report, by the way, that was released in March of 2018 is a huge document, which really goes into great detail. It was prepared by very knowledgeable lawyers at USTR. And it set out a case for the US acting to protect its interests, again, on a unilateral basis. This is not the WTO. It's legal in terms of US law, but there have been people, China included, that have complained that Section 301 is not in compliance with WTO commitments. We had a series then of tariffs that were imposed under Section 301, and they were organized into basically 4 different tranches. And why don't we go to the next slide? And I hope I won't bore you with the details on this, but you probably read or heard on the news periodically, the US imposed duties, and you hear it again a couple months later, and then you hear it again. It was done basically, let's start with list 1, where in April of 2018, USTR imposed 25% duty on $34 billion of products from China. That went into effect July of 2018. Then there was a list 2 that went into effect a month later, August 23rd, another 25% on an additional $16 billion worth of goods. Then we had list 3 a month later, September 24th. It was initially 10% on $200 billion worth of goods from China, but then that was later increased to 25%. List 4 was bifurcated as if this wasn't confusing enough. Now we have a list 4A and a list 4B. 4A went into effect September of last year, 15% tariff on another $112 billion worth of goods. List 4B tariffs were announced, but they were never implemented. Now, again, similar to Section 232, China responded to the 301 duties with its own tariffs on US products, which is not surprising. They, like most trading partners, know what is going to get the attention of the US. So they hit agricultural products, a big hit to American farmers, American farm exports, and we were often running on a trade war. Next slide, please. Nope, going to get to the next slide. All right, so all of that probably brings to mind stories you heard, once again, sound like it was almost every other week. More tariffs on China, more tariffs on China, then China retaliates. It really wasn't creating anything good in terms of two-way trade. It may have been a little late, but I think people in the administration realized this was not being very helpful. In fact, it was harmful when there was retaliation on important US exports. So beginning of this year, pre-COVID, US and China signed what they called phase 1 of the new China agreement, which put a pause to all the escalating tensions. And part of phase 1, China agreed to the following. Over the next 2 years, they would increase imports of US manufactured goods, energy products, ag goods, and services by $200 billion compared to 2017 numbers. Lo and behold, what was it, 2 months later, we had COVID. So those numbers are nowhere near being achieved, not because of reluctance by China, but because of a huge downturn that nobody anticipated. There were also commitments to open up financial services, protect intellectual property. For its part, the US canceled those list 4B tariffs that I mentioned earlier. That was going to be 15% on $160 billion worth of good. And the list 4A tariffs were reduced from 15 to 7.5%. Despite China's non-compliance with the phase 1 deal, Trump administration has not publicly criticized China for this part of the deal. They understand that COVID was a large part of that. I should add here that, like the 232 tariffs, there's also a process for getting exempted from the China 301 tariffs. And again, it's the same process. We have dozens and dozens of clients who have American clients primarily who say, we have no other source of input for these important products but from China. And we export a lot of these finished products. So why should we be punished by paying more duties on imported Chinese imports that we have to have? There's no other source. And again, the record has been mixed, but there have been instances. I'm happy to say we've had a number of clients who have successfully demonstrated that they should be exempted from the tariffs. Now, as opposed to 232, which is run by the Commerce Department, the 301 tariff exemption process is run by the U.S. Trade Representative's Office. So you have a little more opportunity for advocacy, a little more opportunity for legal arguments. And I think the process is one that lends itself a little bit to better judgments by the administration. So that kind of is a snapshot on where we are with the 301 tariff part of the trade war. Now we go to the other side of the coin. Next slide, please. Now we're looking at what has happened in terms of the U.S. restricting foreign investment in the United States. When I say restricting it, it's generally for national security purposes. And the sole target here, in my view, is China. China has been singled out for review. The Congress has been working with the administration. They've tightened the security on foreign investment in the U.S. and ensuring that U.S. technology is better controlled when it's exported. There was a bill passed, it's an odd acronym of FIRMA, Foreign Investment Risk Review Mechanism Modernization Act. And that is the Treasury Department announcing a pilot program to implement provisions of the legislation that didn't become effective immediately upon enactment. And that program that they announced does the following. It expands the scope of transactions subject to review by a committee called CFIUS, Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., to include certain non-controlling investment made by foreign persons in the U.S. in critical technologies, and makes effective FIRMA's mandatory declaration provision for transactions that fall within the scope of the pilot program. Now here, let me note, CFIUS is an interagency group. It is not an agency that receives petitions on any matter. It acts on its own whenever it feels that a proposed merger or acquisition could threaten the national security of the United States. And CFIUS on its own initiates an investigation. This is not an open process or proceeding where you are allowed to present legal arguments. This is an administrative review that, despite possibly the willingness of two private parties, let's say a Chinese party and an American party, CFIUS can overrule that decision to merge or acquire if it feels that the result would create a threat to the national security of the United States. Now, this doesn't mention China by name, but it's clear that the intent, anything you read or see tweeted, indicates that the focus is on investments by China. And wherever there's a possible threat to United States security, CFIUS and FIRMA will come in to stop that action. Next slide, please. Then we have the question of Chinese espionage. Going back to November of 18, we saw that there was a piece published where it talked about Chinese espionage activities against the United States based on the illegal export of military and dual-use technology. You see a quote there from March of last year by the director of the FBI saying that the US has too long been under-focused on Chinese spying, including in cyberspace. And the quote that I have here is when he said, of all things that surprised me when I came back into this world, the thing that most shocked me was the depth, breadth, scale of the Chinese counterintelligence threat. Next slide, please. Oh, I think there's one that you skipped. It should be enforcement continued. There we go. Here you see Ray said that all 50 FBI field offices have active investigations into China espionage. They're listed here. I won't go into detail, but you probably remember not that long ago in July, the US forced China to close its consulate in Houston because of allegations of espionage. Again, China doesn't sit back and simply take these things. They retaliated and forced the United States to close its consulate in Chengdu. So you see through all of these activities, the tariff actions, the trade actions, the investment restrictions, the espionage investigations, it has heightened tensions in the US-China relationship. Now, fortunately, we did have a phase one agreement, but there's a real question as to whether there will be a phase two, a phase three. Trump didn't really explain what phase one was and how it related to other issues. Phase one really does not address the substantive issues that concern policymakers when it comes to own enterprises and things like that. So I'll get to that at the end when we talk about going forward. But right now, that's where we are with respect to the US and China on a bilateral basis. Now let's expand it a little bit to a multilateral basis. Next slide, please. The WTO, you've heard of that, is in the news recently. They have a very long, elaborate process for selecting the next directorate general. It came down, they started out with, I think, 15 candidates. It was down to two women. A woman from Nigeria who's former number 2 at the World Bank, former finance minister, and a former trade negotiator in Korea. And in case you haven't read it, the vast majority of the votes went to the Nigerian candidate, but the US supported the Korean candidate, saying that her experience, hands-on experience in the WTO, makes her the required choice. This has the possibility of further scuttling the WTO. And if you've been reading the papers lately, the WTO has started to become a moribund institution for a number of reasons. Part is the United States, which has been holding up the appointment of appellate body judges. We're now at a point in the WTO where it is technically impossible for appeals to be heard because there aren't enough judges that have been confirmed to hear cases. And that's due to the US holding up appointments. So you have a huge backlog that's due to US intransigence by the Trump administration. You also have, sadly, complete absence of activity on multilateral trade agreements. You hear about all kinds, I talked about bilateral trade agreements, the US and Kenya, the US and the UK, regional agreements like the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, the TPP. All of those are really happening because there is no process in place for multilateral trade agreements in the WTO. There hasn't been since 2000, when what was called the Doha round collapsed. And prior to that, countries worked through the WTO, or prior to that, the GATT, to together agree on tariff reductions, trade expansion. That's how we had the Tokyo round and the Uruguay round. All of those were rounds of negotiations in prior WTO or GATT proceedings that everybody participated in. You can blame a lot of people for why Doha collapsed. There's a lot of blame to go around. But the sad fact is that the WTO has become essentially irrelevant as a forum for achieving multilateral agreements. So that's why we have this tremendous panoply of bilateral regional agreements. Of course, you create all kinds of problems because these agreements all have different rules of origin. They have different technical requirements. So it takes a lot of lawyers, maybe I shouldn't complain, a lot of lawyers to sift through what's allowed where and how this is all to be reconciled. The only thing you had at a time was the WTO serving to resolve disputes, a dispute settlement body. And as I mentioned earlier, the Trump administration has basically stopped that from happening. As I mentioned at the outset, going back to the slide, The Trump administration, you've heard it over and over again, they're transactional. They prefer to deal on a bilateral basis. And that's how they've worked with China. 301, everything I've talked about has been a bilateral process by the United States and China. But there have been efforts to work with other trading partners to come up with some international pressure on China to operate better within a rules-based system. That's been done two ways. There's a trilateral format now in place with the US, Japan, and Europe. That really hasn't gone anywhere. I'm not terribly optimistic because the Trump administration has a much different view than the EU or Japan. And then there are proposed WTO reforms. Everybody agrees that the WTO needs to be reformed, but people have different ideas on exactly how that reform should be carried out. Next slide, please. So here we see how, well, let me back up. February of 2019, China, India, South Africa, Venezuela defended a practice of the WTO that allows members to self-designate themselves as developing. And that is an issue that the US has been vocally critical of. When you have developing country status, you don't have requirements or full obligations under the WTO. So it's a bit of a safe haven. The position of the US is that the countries that are complaining are using that developing country category to avoid their WTO obligations. And they're pointing to the GDP of these countries, other designations made by the World Bank and the OECD, and saying these countries clearly should not be designated as developing countries and should be graduated from that position. Next slide, please. So, the US proposed in the WTO that if a member fell into any of these four categories, it wouldn't be able to claim its developing status. In WTO terms, we call that special and differential treatment. They can't claim it if, one, they're a member of the OECD, or if they're a member of the G20, or if the World Bank has classified them as high income, or if it accounts for no less than 0.5% of global merchandise trade. If you look at those four categories, that would knock out not only China and India, but Mexico, Israel, China, or Chile, Argentina, South Korea, Turkey, Indonesia, South Africa or Singapore, Croatia, Saudi Arabia, and there are others. So China naturally objected to this approach, citing differences between developed and developing WTO members in terms of per capita income, science and technology, quality of development. So you see here that it's an ongoing dispute as to when a country member of the WTO, in theory, a developing country ought to be given special consideration. A full member country ought to live up to its full responsibilities. But the real question is, which countries deserve that special treatment and which countries are hiding behind that guise to avoid their WTO obligations. Next slide, please. I don't have time really to go into a fascinating project by China, the One Belt, One Road initiative. I'm sure you've all read about that, heard about it. It's been very active in Africa in particular. It's a development strategy by the Chinese government involving infrastructure development and investments in countries in Africa, Asia, and Europe. December of 2018, when John Bolton was the National Security Advisor, he described a strategy by the United States that would counter the BRI. Needless to say, with the departure of Mr. Bolton, we saw the departure of this new strategy. So we have concerns. There are books written all the time about this Belt and Road Initiative. I've got one right here somewhere. It's a concern. It technically doesn't create WTO problems until you get into the details of individual transactions. But the fact that China is expanding, I'm going beyond trade now, more into a geopolitical analysis. I think that's where I would say that there is an additional concern on China's strategy when you look at what has happened in the trade area compared to what we have on broader geopolitics like BRI. Next slide, please. Here are some, I kind of breezed through because number one, I didn't want to bore you, and number two, I'm cognizant of the time and your time. But if you, and I think you can have access to this PowerPoint, if you look at these different blogs and releases we put out, you'll get more detail than you want to know about these different lists of tariffs. It's a very complicated area. I tried to simplify it a bit, but if you knew that and you want to learn more, these are some references that you can look at. Let me, I think that's it for the slides. Isn't that, Delang, that could be the last one. Yes, so let me wrap up by kind of bringing us up to date for some things that happened recently. Last month, there were over 3,000 lawsuits filed in the US Court of International Trade seeking refunds on certain of those duties that were paid under Section 301. They all followed a complaint filed on September 10th by a company called HTMX that wanted refunds of the third and fourth tier tariffs. They said they were unlawful. They were imposed after the 12-month deadline to act following the end of the 301 investigation. There's a legal requirement for when you have to stop imposing 301 tariffs. And they make an argument, which is now pending, that the $200 billion of goods under tier 3 and the $120 billion under tier 4 were collected unlawfully. And because of that lawsuit, it caught everybody's attention, particularly since the court opined that if you didn't file a claim of your own, you weren't necessarily entitled to a refund of those duties. And that's why we have over 3,000 lawsuits that have been filed. I think our firm alone has filed about 25 of them. So we're not alone, obviously. That's where we are in the court system. In the WTO, this was just this week on October 26th, the US government appealed the WTO ruling. Remember I said China took us to the WTO 301. They won. The ruling was that we violated WTO rules. Therefore, we are appealing to the dispute settlement body. Remember what I said earlier. There is no functioning dispute settlement body because the US has held up the appointment of additional judges. So that was kind of a deliberate action to stall anything further in terms of addressing the WTO. So you have actions in the US courts, you have actions in the international multilateral fora, and now finally, let me close on what's going to happen on Tuesday, which is our own presidential elections. If Mr. Trump is reelected, it's unclear whether or not there will be a phase 2, a phase 3, a phase 4. I think there is a realization that those years of added tariffs did not really accomplish anything other than adding costs to consumers in China and in the United States. So I would like to think that there would be a pause on that. Maybe they get to a phase 2. Maybe they look at structural problems. That's really the issue to deal with in China. And that's where I think Congress is as well. Congress, whether it's Democrat or Republican, is basically of a mind that we should be tougher on China. The question is the tactics rather than the strategy. But there's also a willingness and a frankness to understand the importance of that relationship and the fact that there should not be unilateral action taken against China without consultations. If Mr. Biden is elected, I think his China position will be much more nuanced and more structured. I would predict he would probably go back to something that existed under the Obama administration, what we call the Strategic and Economic Dialogue. There was a formal mechanism for discussions between the US and China. It will be, as I said, more nuanced, more structured. There'll be a forum where both sides can discuss and come to an agreement rather than ad hoc actions by the US administration, which is then forces retaliatory action by China. Substantively, I don't think he's not going to be soft on China, particularly as he's been campaigning. The question is, will he remove those 232 tariffs? Will he remove the 301 tariffs? It's unclear in my mind at this point. I think he is aware of the sensitivity of the steel industry and those tariffs, but I've got to believe he will be of a mind to gradually eliminate those tariffs, modify them in some way. But as an elected politician, he will seek some sort of concessions from China to get back to a center ground. I think with a Biden presidency, we'll probably see, again, a more structured approach to the bilateral relationship, a better way of maintaining dialogue between the two parties. Congress, as I've said in the past, has been generally supportive of tough action on China. They were the ones that passed the FIRMA legislation that I mentioned. But I think that a lot of people in Congress have a much more pragmatic view of the importance of the bilateral relationship. And that's really what this all comes down to. These are the two greatest trading nations on earth and the two most important. And it doesn't do either country good to engage in continued tariff fights. Tariffs really aren't a good answer for anything. They simply are. Tariffs are a tax. If Trump was going to be saying he's in favor of additional taxes, politically, it would be a much different story. But I think there is room for agreement on broader issues. That's why I mentioned the strategic and economic dialogue. There's an opportunity for China to act in accordance with WTO principles. But there's also a possibility for the U.S. to be more multilateral in their approach. And I go back to the beginning of my remarks when I said that the TPP was something the U.S. should not have withdrawn from. The TPP is an alliance, as you know, of like-minded countries that have decided to open up market access. Japan is essentially leading that effort now. If Mr. Biden is elected, I would think he would re-enter the TPP. China is not a member, but the importance from the US is that if we can set the rules on important areas, for example, state-owned enterprises, in the TPP, then there is a little bit more of coherence, a unified strategy by certain developed countries that China would then need to address one way or the other. Even if they don't adhere to the TPP, there are certain motivations for them to come into compliance. So I hope that was helpful. I hope I always debate how much detail I should go into, at the risk of boring people going into too much or skimming over everything, and therefore leaving people wanting more. I believe that this PowerPoint presentation will be available to all participants. So feel you've got my contact points there. You can follow us on Twitter and all these other good things that are listed there. I'm happy to answer any questions. You've got my email address there. Ying and Dai Lang and Steve, I hope I sort of came in about on time as far as your scheduling, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Frank. Round of applause again. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think you hit it just right, Frank. It's, the detail is so fascinating, and those of us who are paying attention to the issues don't have anywhere near your level of detailed expertise on precisely how this is unfolding. It affects all of us. So I think the detail is really welcome. I think DeYoung mentioned if you'd like to ask a question, maybe the best way is to put a question into the chat box, and then we can call on you and you can unmute yourself. So who would like to go first?
So here we already have a signal from Matthew Martin. So Matthew, can you unmute yourself, ask directly?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Samolis. I'm a first-year law student here, and I'm Matt. And I'm wondering, Mr. Samolis, in your view, to what extent has President Trump's unorthodox actions, such as 232 safeguards, been normalized, and whether there's now U.S. industries or companies that embrace them, so that there's now maybe political motivations to continue using them, or if they're going to kind of fade back into the dustbin of trade policy actions after Trump is out of office?
It's a very good question. Thank you, Dan. I think with respect to 232 that people have had enough of this incredible bureaucracy. You created a huge government bureaucracy when you imposed these 232 tariffs, and then you allowed for exemptions. And the minute you do that, you create a lot of work for the lawyers. Again, 232 was really in the dustbin up until Mr. Trump was elected. If you look at the statute again, it does permit Trump to do what he did, but I think he overused it. And when you've got members of Congress, and let me say, important Republican senators such as Chuck Grassley, who have said, I don't think this is what Section 232 was designed to do. And if it's going to be used this way, Congress sure as hell better have a say in how this is done. We can't have a president, not necessarily Mr. Trump, we can't have any president using this statute in a way that neglects input from the Congress. And remember, we have a very unique constitutional experiment when it comes to trade policy. If you look at the Constitution, it's given to Congress. Congress delegates it to the executive branch. So when you have trade agreements approved, remember legally, trade agreements are not treaties. They're not self-executing. You don't have like just a vote in the Senate. You have to have both houses pass the implementing legislation. So historically and traditionally, Congress and the executive branch have to work hand in glove on most major trade issues. And I think Senator Grassley has a point. Section 232, if it's going to continue, ought to be amended in a way that gives Congress a role before any president acts in a unilateral fashion. So that would be my hope, is that it becomes, I don't think it has to be eliminated, but I think it can be modified. Remember, private parties can also bring actions under Section 232, and it has been done in the Trump administration on certain chemical products, nuclear, and the uranium was a 232 investigation. So there's nothing stopping a company. Now, if a company files a petition, they better have a good case on the merits, because the recommendation is by the administration. When the president of the United States says he's initiating investigation, I really think it's difficult for one of his underlings, even the Secretary of Commerce, to say, well, we don't think there's merit to that. That's not how it works. And the same with Section 301. I think if there's a Biden administration, we will be much more multilateral in our approach. We'll probably go back to the WTO. We'll probably open up the appellate body process, so we actually have a dispute settlement body in the WTO. But that's my hope. If Trump is reelected, we will see what happens. Thanks for the question.
Oh, the next question is from Donald Schilling, which is, given growing nationalism in China, how flexible will the Chinese government be on negotiation of these issues?
That's a very good point. I mean, I focus my remarks on politics in the US, and I certainly don't pretend to be an expert on politics in China, but you have to believe that the politics there are just as important. There is growing nationalism. Xi has issues that he needs to contend with internally. So I think it will be, for Mr. Trump, we may not get to a phase two if both sides dig in their heels on that. With the Biden administration, whenever you have a new administration in any major country, I think people reset their expectations and are willing to start a new process. That's why I think Biden administration will probably have a better chance of making some progress. But I don't deny that it could be, if Trump and Xi decide enough is enough, let's come back to the table, let's start addressing phase two, that could very well happen. But the results of phase two, I think, are more to Don's point about saying increased nationalism may put some real restrictions on what China can offer. And of course, there's no guarantee or promise that either side is going to make significant concessions. Thanks.
Professor Deborah Hugh, do you want to ask it directly? Yeah, please.
Sure, thank you. Thank you so much for your comments. Absolutely fascinating. So I'm an economist and have worked on trade for most of my career. So I'm familiar with all the economic research that has shown through the years that not only trade is beneficial both to the parties involved, but globally, it stimulates growth, income, et cetera, around the world. But that it, even within trade, multilateralism is the preferred approach versus bilateral negotiations, which you touched on briefly. I was very interested to hear your perspective on that issue. What other impacts do you see of the move from multilateral trade discussions to a more bilateral approach? Because as you also focused on, it's not just US, China, but now the whole system has sort of broken down and it's everybody for himself. Thank you for your comments.
Right, thank you. You raise a very good point. There is an explosion of trade agreements. There's a website, I think if you go on www.bilaterals.org, you will see the hundreds of trade agreements, forget US and China, between countries all around the world that are pursuing a bilateral approach. It's not the way to expand trade. Actually, technically, all these bilateral agreements are in violation of the WTO, which requires non-discriminatory treatment. Anything you offer one country should be offered to others. Now, the way we have gotten around that is through getting waivers in the WTO, and that's why we have had the NAFTA agreement and these bilateral trade agreements, but it's not the way the system is supposed to work. So I think there is increased movement or momentum toward a bilateral approach, but it takes international leadership. In my view, look at the WTO. If you really had an administration in the US and in China and in Europe that came together and said, we need to reset. We need to take a look at how this multilateral institution, it goes back when the IMF was created and the World Bank and all these other things after World War II. You created the GATT. But we've now seen it so neutered that countries, when trade is growing, they look to the next best thing. And the next best thing is a bilateral agreement. That's, for all the reasons I mentioned, that's not a good thing. And it's not really growing trade in the best possible way. So I would hope that we would have a rejuvenation of the WTO to create a better working multilateral process. Thanks.
Okay, and next is, I think it's not a question, but it's a comment from Yang Yong Lee. It says, the notion of developing country is a key term in WTO. However, if China loses its position as a developing country, China will suffer a very difficult situation. So what's your view on this?
Well, in my view, again, I mentioned the different tests you have for what constitutes the developing country, but I think, look, China is number one or number two player in the world. And I think I understand some of the particular arguments, but I think they need to step up for their responsibilities. They're a leader and they ought to take a leadership position. It's hard for a developing country to really have that kind of visibility. India, for example, India can make an impact, but India, I think, has more of a claim to developing country status. And for that reason, shouldn't be expected to take a leadership position. That's where I would see China, hoping that China would grab the mantle, grab the baton, and work with the United States as a true developed country that has all sorts of resources and tremendous economic growth, a tremendous economic engine. And if there's an agreement to work together, that's where I would like to see China sort of cast off the shell of a developing country and become more of a leader on a multilateral platform. Thanks.
Okay, next, let's give the opportunity to Shirley Shenfu. You can ask now.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. Actually, it's not a pure question, but I am a current LLM in the William and Mary Law School. And also I practice law in China and focus on the foreign direct investment. So during learning the William and Mary, I do learn two things, that the geographic tension relation between the US and China can be resolved by effective negotiation or the mediation. For example, just like what Henry Kissinger did in early 1970s, or another example, for example, for the President Carter, when they had the David Camp in the 13 days. So my question is that I think if it is just a temporary the relationship in this kind of the tension relationship, so what our LLM or international lawyers can contribute to resolve this kind of the tension and try our best to help our client to still doing the investment in the United States, because they already did it 20 years ago. It's unstoppable because their business is global. It's not only happening in the United States or China, it's a global chain. So do you have any advice for us, just like the international lawyers? How can we help our client? And if our client gets some trouble in the United States, which the organization we can ask for help in the first, do they have any the mediation or litigation organization focused on try to deal with the trade war between the United States and the States? I just have this kind of the questions and the comments. And also thank you so much for your detailed lecture today. It's very, very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. You raised some good points. As a private lawyer advising clients, if they're businesses, they really have a pressing, immediate need. You know, it goes to the mainly U.S. company, a bottom line issue. What the hell's going on? Now I've got to pay an extra 25%. They're looking for tactical responses to conditions that were imposed on them from governments. They don't like it. They are trying to figure out how to respond. So they look to a Washington trade lawyer to give them that kind of advice. That's a short-term tactical necessary, but short-term measure. There are broader issues that you refer to in terms of international dispute resolution, arbitration. That's another avenue that we didn't have time to get into today, but those are ones where the US and China can view and resolve issues and underscore the rule of law through established arbitration rules. Again, that's a whole different body of law, and it's one that addresses broader avenues for resolving legal disputes. But in the broader term, I keep coming back to the notion that countries as big as important as China and the US need to take on a leadership role. They should take a position of creating an atmosphere, creating institutions that really effectuate better adherence to the rule of law. So you've got arbitration. Again, that's not quite as short term as tariff actions, but longer term, you need to reform some of these institutions. I talked a lot about the WTO, but you're looking at the IMF and the World Bank. All of those institutions can be reformed in a way that would benefit both China and the US if people would focus on that rather than the nitty-gritty of tariffs. Thank you.
So Frank, I think I'll take the chair's privilege and ask a question, if I may.
Sure.
And I'm just curious, if your firm ever deals with a really big export we care a lot about at William and Mary, and that's the export of higher education. Officially, I have seen it estimated as the 6th biggest export industry in the United States. That may be, our industry lobbyists saying that, but it's definitely large. In the state of Virginia, it's about $500 million in terms of the money that comes in directly from international students, but also the downstream effects, the purchases of housing and
right.
Yeah. So it's actually a very, very important part of the Virginia Commonwealth economy, not really known necessarily. We often find when we tell our local representatives that they didn't know that particular statistic. But it's under huge attack by this administration. So, whether we look at travel bans, the changes in visa rules, investigations of students, attacks on optional practical training, Obviously, that hits the William and Mary bottom line too, to be honest. So I'm wondering if your firm or other firms like Squire Patton Boggs ever get involved in that export industry, or is it somehow segmented in the legal community? So it's sort of handled by different people, and it's sort of
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, it's a good question. We do get involved on behalf of different countries from time to time. I mentioned I represent Korea. We are helping them try and get some legislation passed in the Congress, which is called the Partnership with Korea Act, that among other things creates more opportunities for student visas and expanded educational opportunities. It's frankly opposed by this administration, so we've got some supporters in Congress, but this could be a long battle, and Korea's in it for the long haul. We also advise other colleges and countries in terms of establishing foreign campuses. So, for example, we were instrumental in getting Georgetown University's campus in Doha, Qatar established. We represented Qatar at the time, so that was a big plus for us to be able to do that. But you're right, in terms of, people, when you talk about trade, people think immediately of merchandise trade. And then if they stop and think about services, they're always thinking about Google and Amazon and Twitter and that kind of thing. So education, I think, is a key area because it's so important for us to keep those avenues open. I know the Confucius Institute has done a lot to promote that. We ought to be doing more of it. And it is, unfortunately, Steve, it is kind of a footnote to what a typical trade lawyer does, but from time to time it does come up, and I understand the importance, and that's really something where broader legislation, rather than one country like Korea, it ought to be broader in terms of educational opportunities in the US.
Thank you so much. And I'll mention, if there's anybody in Professor Pittman's class who'd like to ask a question, don't be shy. We know you're in a large room, but you could come up and let us know.
Okay, Haoran, it's your turn. You want to ask now? Haoran Chen.
Oh, yes. Thank you for your lecture today. And my question is based on the circumstance on COVID-19, the worldwide trade has been influenced so huge. So can we see that as somehow escalate this tension or relieve this tension? So what do you think that?
Well, yeah, it's, again, nobody predicted this. Nobody knew it was going to happen. And here we are in the middle of it. And now we're hearing that cases are spiking. So it's not, I don't think we're turning the corner. We're turning the corner into a worse traffic jam, I think. But there is a trade effect on COVID. Now, there have been attempts to take off the tariff retaliation list certain PPE equipment, which has been helpful. But that's a very spotty approach. And it's a very isolated action. COVID is really shifting a lot. You've seen the projections by the WTO and the World Bank about growth in international trade. It's actually severely impacting the growth in trade, but it's also emphasizing another issue that I should have mentioned in my lecture, but let me briefly talk about it. And that has to do with this concept of production sharing, which is a fancy way of saying that countries other than China are looking to get the business of companies now in China who are looking to create a plan B. I don't think anybody's going to abandon China, but they are going to look to alternative countries, alternative sources of supply to modify their supply chains. And I can tell you that we're advising some countries in the Western Hemisphere. We're talking about co-production in the Western Hemisphere. I think it's very difficult. I know Mr. Trump has said that, we need to get these jobs back in America, but for a variety of competitive reasons, it's far likelier that some of those operations now done in China may be done in the Western Hemisphere, it may be done in India, could be done in Egypt. Nobody knows for sure. I think sometimes people get a little bit overly optimistic about the amount of that business that can actually be sourced out of China. I don't think it will really put a big dent in the current supply operations, but I do think there is something to be said for some production sharing in other countries, just so companies have an insurance policy or a plan B. not only in a trade war, but also if there's another COVID, another pandemic, sourcing closer to the United States could be one way of addressing that. Thanks for your question.
Thank
All
you.
right. Kaiming Chen, are you there? You are next.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes.
Yep. So I'm really interested in this notion that you brought about China being take up a leadership role in the world stage. But I feel like in order to be a leader, essentially you have to be accepted by the people. And the people today, I don't feel like there's a particularly favorable attitude towards China, because you see in the US, like the president is talking about China virus. And I believe this kind of sentiment is actually spreading around the world, where people maybe not like say it directly, but there's kind of a implicit assumption that it is this whole COVID thing was because of China. And under this context, I don't really see how China is going to take any kind of leadership role other than just developing its economy, I guess.
Yeah, it's a fair point. Unfortunately, our president never misses an opportunity to say that COVID came from China. But it's an easy way for him to turn it into a political issue for re-election, as opposed to addressing the real issues of COVID that affect people in the United States, which is coming up with a program that will help US citizens, as opposed to pointing fingers at who started it all. It's a little bit like the tariff issue. So you do raise a point that that message, particularly by a president of the United States, does contaminate the thinking, I think, of the average citizen and a business leader. So it's easy for me to say China ought to step up and be a leader and leave it at that, but it's much more complicated than that. I really think that if we do have a new administration here, that may be the best way for the two governments to say, let's start over. Let's go back to something that makes sense. Let's work together. We're competitors. We always will be, but let's see if there's a common set of rules we can agree on. That's not a guarantee of success. I'm certainly aware of the issue you raised, that there is, it's been a lot of suspicion about China. Members of Congress can sometimes be worse than the president in terms of the vitriol they have towards China. So it will take time. I think it will take some leadership from not only China, but the US. Leaders in the US are willing to say it's in everybody's interest to have a better multilateral approach and a common alliance to work together. We won't come to an agreement on everything, but it's better than shooting arrows across the bow in the form of tariffs. So I appreciate your point. It's easy for me to say, it's very hard to do. Thanks.
Xiaoling Chen, Xiaoling Yu, sorry, Xiaoling Yu, it's your turn. You can ask now. Unmute yourself, please. We cannot hear you.
Yes.
Unmute.
Okay. My question is very simple but important to the lawyers. Our lawyer focus on the American and Chinese trade the manufacturer for many years. What should we do for the next step? Yeah, just this question.
Well, yeah, I think being knowledgeable about what's going on is number one. Number two is providing input. Now, I mentioned a lot of these actions were taken on a unilateral basis, but you will occasionally see invitations by a department to publicly comment on proposed rules or regulations. If they have a negative impact on your business, that's an opportunity to weigh in. There are also opportunities to present testimony to the agency or in Congress for that matter. I think it's, and also working through your associations. I mean, every company belongs to some trade association. The more power a big association has, the more potential it has to affect policy. So I think it's not always best to go it alone as a company. Sometimes you can join forces with other like-minded companies. And for the most part, you find that in trade associations that all have a common interest in keeping the flow of trade open rather than closed. So those are the steps I would encourage. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Time is concerned, we have to wrap up very soon. So let's give the last question to Deborah. So Deborah, you want to ask again? I've noticed you have another question.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. I wonder if you would comment on what you think might be potential response by China if things don't improve, say with another administration or with the changing of the administration. In the beginning, we would put on a tariff, they would impose tariffs on about the same amount. We'd put on more tariffs, they would sort of tit for tat, back and forth. But they, of course, ran out pretty quick because we import a lot more from them than they do from us. So they started relying on other measures, other retaliatory measures, imposing restrictions on Google and et cetera, et cetera. Do you have some thoughts on what other measures they might take going forward, things we better be careful about?
Oh, that's quite a last question. Thank you, Deborah. China has all kinds of tools available to it. The tariffs are really kind of the least harmful in many ways. We are so dependent on China for assembly manufacturing that there are all kinds of restrictions on investments in China that they could further clamp down on. There are possibilities for them in terms of foreign ownership that they could clamp down on. And, kind of the nuclear button is the amount of US treasuries held by China. They could really disrupt the financial, should they choose to do that. Now, they understand as well as anybody that that doesn't just hurt the US, it hurts them as well. But if they're really looking at punitive action, boy, that would make tariffs look like a walk in the park. And then there are things that I don't pretend to really understand, but I read about periodically in terms of cyber currencies and things. And I believe China is ahead of the US on this. And again, I don't pretend to be an expert, but I think there are ways to modify financial institutions so that you create a mechanism for doing business that doesn't involve the transmission of US dollars. And in practical terms, that means a perfect way to avoid US sanctions, whether it's on Russia or whether it's on Iran or Venezuela. So again, that's a pretty serious action, but imagine China creating a virtual bank where you can effectuate transactions of petroleum with Iran or a gas from Russia or any of these things that totally avoid US sanctions and allow foreign companies, non-Chinese but non-US, to profit through areas that are now being restricted by US sanctions. So it's kind of an extraterritorial tit for tat, if you want to put it that way. That's when you're really getting into scary stuff. But thanks for your question.
That is scary. Perfect for Halloween. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. Thank you for organizing this. Again, always a pleasure. I look forward every fall to coming to William and Mary. This time, virtual is the best we can do, but to everybody, Ying, Dailang, and Steve and Jennifer, you guys have been always so gracious and welcoming. And now with Don Schilling, I've got another reason to go to Williamsburg. So I'm happy to come there anytime. Happy to see any of you if you're ever able to travel from Williamsburg to Washington. Happy to share a cup of coffee with you, with masks on, of course.
Thank you so much, Frank. We really enjoyed it, and I know everybody learned a ton. So one last round of applause.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.